Here, let's go. Go ahead and write down a U.S. mint at the top of it.
I said I needed one. Thank you.
There you go. Everybody else good? Let me get a chair here. You go ahead and close that and put it up.
Thank you for being so nice.
He was like open the door.
Whether it's shingles in our pockets or folds in our wallets, influenced by the millions from government agencies that have mastered the craft of making it, empowering consumers and confounding counterfeiters. Result in time-honored technology, painstaking artistry, and precision automation. Now, with money on modern marvels. They say that you can't buy happiness, and that the love of it is the root of all evil. But most of us seem to be obsessed with earning, saving, and spending it. For better or worse, money is the measure of all things in America. And two agencies work around the clock, satisfying our demand for it. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing produces our paper currency. And the United States Mint, the largest mint in the world, manufactures our coins.
We are the largest mint in large measure because we have the world's largest economy. Many mints worldwide have had to slow their production down. In fact, some have had to shut their production down. On the other hand, because of the size of our economy, have had very smooth production capacity.
The U.S. Mint runs production facilities in Denver, San Francisco, and West Point. But for more than 2 centuries, the heart of its operation has been in downtown Philadelphia. You can count on this money-making factory to pump out a staggering 11 billion coins each year.
Good fact right now.
On an average day, we make over 30 million coins. About half of them are pennies, and the rest are split between nickels, dimes, and quarters.
No parts of the Mint's automated production line are more critical than the dies from which the coins are stamped. Creating them is a meticulous and time-consuming challenge. The process begins with drawings crafted by the Mint staff of sculptor engravers.
Today, we do it all on computers, and every image is drawn separately, scanned into the computer. The lettering and all the text is generated separately. And we can move it around, increase the size, reduce the size, change the size of the image if the image is too large. Just kind of tweak it to the point where we never could tweak it before.
The approved drawing is the basis for an oversized model, sculpted first in clay, then plaster. Sculpting an enlargement enables the artists to include a greater degree of fine detail.
This is the reverse of the 2006 Nevada State Quarter. I'm putting in the final touches now, and I'm using a tool now to put some straight edges on some of these rays of the sun. They need a little cleanup after the casting. Sometimes there's little pieces that mar the edge. We have a very thin parameter of relief that we can work on in something like this. This is an 8-inch blank, and I think our maximum relief is around 80 thousandths of an inch, and that's the highest point.
A crucial step ahead requires a significantly harder replica of the plaster model. So workers craft a rubber mold that they can then use to make an epoxy copy. With the brush, we're trying to be sure we don't trap any air bubbles in the detail on the rubber mold. And we'll leave this sit overnight, just at air temperature. It'll be hard to the touch in about 6 hours, and it'll take about 18 hours before it's fully cured, and we can separate it tomorrow morning.
The resulting epoxy model is hard enough to withstand the rigors of this machine. The Janvier reducing lathes first arrived from France in 1906, and they're still going strong. They transfer the
They're
contours of
using
the large
machines over
models
100 years
with
old to
minute
make those
precision
coins.
to the heads of coin-sized steel cylinders.
What's going on here is this
That thing's
stylus is
tracing the
actually
bottles, and then
riding
the
on
real
the
one's
surface
cutting
of
it out
the
of
large
metal with a
epoxy
smaller
model.
die.
And as it moves in and out, this arm also moves in and out, causing this cutter to move in and out and actually trace the image into the steel. This machine is completely mechanical in that there's no computer assistance at all. It's all done through electrical relays, leather belts, and screws and cone drives.
Transferring the features of the model to what's called the reduction hub takes as long as 12 hours and requires several repetitions. When the hub is ready, it's used to craft the master die. The master die will be a reverse image of the hub, with recessed rather than raised features. This crucial step allows no margin for error.
Any little water will imprint on this, fingerprints will imprint, lip marks, dust, dirt, all will mess this thing up from the get-go.
In the die press, the reduction hub is positioned on top of a steel cylinder with a cone-shaped head, precisely aligned with a centering ring. A press descends, flattening the cylinder against the hub. The cylinder's coned end prevents the cylinder from absorbing all the tonnage at one instant, and allows its metal to flow in and around the hub's relief. There's still some touch-up work to do, and duplicates for use on the production line will have to be made. But what emerges is the stuff that coins are made of.
And the end result is a brand new master die.
The process of creating a master die may be slow and methodical, but the coin production it empowers blurs by at a lightning pace. It begins with prefabricated metal strips coiled into rolls 1,500 feet long. The coils are fed into a machine that punches out round discs called blanks. The blanks for pennies come ready-made from the mint supplier.
After blanking, all the blanks go through a furnace where they're heat treated to soften the metal. We have hard metal to get good sharp blanks, but then we need to soften the metal to be able to strike our coin.
Next, machines wash the blanks to improve the coin's final appearance. And after other machines dry them, they flow into a device called an upsetting mill. The machine raises a rim around the blank's edge that will be higher than the coin's relief, protecting the design. A horizontal wheel with a grooved edge rotates near a curved section of steel with a corresponding groove. The blank spins into the channel, which grows progressively narrower. When the channel becomes narrower than the blank itself, the blank flattens at its edge.
That raised edge or rimming helps preform the blank so that when it goes into the press, it's actually struck into a coin. We get better fill, better appearance of the overall coin.
Finally, conveyors whisk the blanks to the coining presses, and they're close encounter with the master working dies. Each press can stamp out 750 coins per minute.
Our coins are struck using two dies that are installed in the stamping presses. One makes the heads or the obverse, one makes the tails or the reverse. One is stationary and that's called the anvil, one moves and that's called the hammer. The blank comes in between, the one die moves and strikes the blank in between that die and the other die, creating the impression of the coin on both sides at the same time.
To ensure that nothing's gone wrong anywhere on the production line, inspectors scrutinize the newly stamped coins.
It would be an impossible task to inspect each and every coin. What our operators do is they sample ones that are collected in a trap or a reservoir just outside the press. When They're satisfied that it meets our quality standards. They release the tract, and those coins that are made in a similar time period then flow on through the process to be counted and bagged.
Each of the bags into which the counted coins fall weighs roughly 2,000 pounds, ready for shipment to the Federal Reserve. This efficient production process would have no doubt amazed the founding father, largely responsible for the mint's founding. When Thomas Jefferson became America's first Secretary of State in 1789, the new nation's monetary system floundered in chaos. No unified form of currency existed. The individual colonies circulated a wide variety of bills and coins. And that was only part of the problem.
As the country expanded and we had foreign colonials coming here from France and Britain and Spain and Portugal and Germany, their currency was oftentimes used as a form of commerce.
And it was a mess because every colony had its own exchange rate. So Jefferson really came to understand how over the long term the country just could not conduct its business and it could not conduct its economy with this kind of system. He advocated the creation of a decimal coinage system in the United States and the creation of a mint.
America's first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, shared Jefferson's passion to reform the nation's currency. But the two political rivals, constantly at odds, disagreed about what form that currency should take.
Hamilton believed in banknotes. Jefferson believed in coinage. So it's not surprising in 1792, when the Mint Act was signed, that coins were placed under the Secretary of State, where Thomas Jefferson was secretary. The first mint was established to produce coins and not notes. And that is important in terms of the history of the country. Notes didn't really start to enter circulation until much later.
The U.S. Mint was erected on the site of an abandoned brewery in Philadelphia, then the nation's capital. Production commenced in 1793.
President Washington lived only a few blocks from the first mint, and it is thought that perhaps Martha Washington donated some of her silver to the Philadelphia mints for some of the first production. While we don't have any documentation on that, we do know that some of the first copper that was used was from Paul Revere's manufacturing company and was used in some of the first coins.
In the old days, there were no
Get to
clay
write down
models.
your facts.
The engravers would actually work directly into steel. This is what they generally look like. And what they would do is they would transfer the drawing to this round image. They'd use an ink. And then they begin cutting and carving, cutting and carving, cutting and carving, shaping and forming, shaping. And this whole process, I mean, you can see, just look at the detail on this. It's just absolutely amazing. It could take up to 6 months.
In our early days, all the coins were made by hand, and they would take the metal and they would form it into strips using a rolling machine to get the desired thickness or gauge. Once they had the strip, each blank was hand punched from that strip to create a blank. And the blank was then taken to a screw press, placed on top of one die, another die would be positioned above it, and the screw press would be cranked down in order to stamp or impress the image into that metal. And in that method, it took them 3 years to make the first 1,000,000 coins for our nation.
The mint's slow pace irritated Congress, as it failed to meet production demands. More tumultuous times lay ahead, especially when a chance discovery in a remote riverbed triggered events destined to rewrite the mint's history. The first United States coin bearing the likeness of an African American was the Booker T. Washington Memorial $50. It was minted from 1946 to 1951. Money will return on Modern Marvels. We now return to money on Modern Marvels. In 1999, the United States Mint gave the quarter a new look. George Washington still adorns the face, but you can never be sure which of the United States might be emblazoned on the reverse. Every 10 weeks until 2008, the Mint will roll out a new quarter honoring a different state in the order that joined the Union.
collecting the coins. And the mint continues hammering them out by the ton to keep pace with demand. In the early 19th century, the people's demand for federal coinage was no hobby. The economic health of their growing nation hinged on the mint's ability to power a practical system of exchange. But the mint's production still lagged. In the 1820s, the nation's first gold rush complicated its coinage predicament. After prospectors struck it rich in the mountains of Georgia and the Carolinas, they had a wealth of gold dust, but no efficient way to convert it to coins.
You could ship it all the way back to Philadelphia, where it's melted into coins and sent back, but this process took some 6 months. So you were forced oftentimes as a miner or merchant or whatever, to use the gold dust.
A Georgia gunsmith named Templeton Reed had a better idea. He built his own mint, then bought the miner's gold dust and made his own coins.
Under the United States Constitution, only the federal government had the authority to make money. But he was the first of some 40 different individual and private coiners who made coins to feel the need for a medium of exchange in these gold rush areas when the government failed to do so.
In 1838, Congress finally took action, opening mint branches in North Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana.
It made a lot of sense for the United States government to actually establish mints in those locations. That would be, I think, in some ways, the equivalent of shortening the supply chain, is the terminology that we use today, is going to the source of your metal.
The precedent was set. In 1848, when the cry of gold echoed from California, a similar scenario played itself out. Entrepreneurs in San Francisco opened private mints to convert the miners' treasure into coins. 5 years later, the government moved in, absorbed the facilities, and established a branch of the U.S. Mint still in operation today. In the late 1850s, subsequent gold and silver strikes spawned more branches. Nevada's Comstock Lode triggered the creation of the Carson City Mint. And the Pikes Peak Gold Rush in Colorado gave rise to the Mint in Denver. In the meantime, the Mint in Philadelphia had moved to a bigger building, and its equipment now hissed with the power of steam. By 1860, it was pumping out 28 million coins every year. As the government-controlled coinage was gaining strength, the nation's paper currency, controlled by the private sector, was flaunting its weaknesses. Confusion reigned as 1,600 different banks were circulating 7,000 varieties of bills.
The further you got away from those issuing banks, they traded at a discount to face value because of the inconvenience of having to go take them back to that bank. And then once you got a certain distance away, they weren't worth anything. No one would accept them because they didn't know what the creditworthiness of that bank was.
You never really knew what the real value of a Tennessee note would be in Virginia. And in fact, you would never know if a Richmond note would be even acceptable in Baltimore. So those kinds of problems really meant that we needed to have a centralized point of issuing currency.
A catastrophic conflict finally compelled change.
In the 1860s, Congress had realized that they needed some way to finance the Civil War. And one of the things they did was authorize the Secretary of the Treasury to print a paper currency, which was a demand non-interest bearing note. And in fact, it was called a demand note.
The Treasury began production in 1861. Workers operated machinery primitive by today's standards. But the basics of their technique were so sound that they're still being emulated. First, printers applied ink to a metal die. The ink filled the tiny recessed lines and dots of the engraved image, which was carved in reverse. Subsequent steps removed the excess ink from the die's surface.
I'm going to take a piece of what they call crinoline, and what you want to do here is just barely go over the surface, and it's going to take the heaviest part of the excess that ink away.
After covering his hand in talcum powder, the printer then buffed away whatever traces of ink remained.
As you can see, I'm not actually taking the ink out of the engraving, it's just polishing the surface. So if you notice, all of the ink that's left is in the engraving. The rest of it's on my hand.
The inked dye was then ready for the press that would print the banknote. The Treasury's earliest models were known as spider presses because of their long radial handles. They employed a method of printing called intaglio.
And intaglio basically means beneath the surface. It is where you press the image into the substrate, in this case the paper.
An intaglio press draws the blank paper positioned atop the engraving, beneath its drum. This forces the paper into the dye's finely recessed lines to absorb the ink. The resulting banknote features a subtle three-dimensional effect. The surface of the note is slightly raised.
If you pass your hand on any object that's intaglio printed, you will be able to feel differences and ridges, and that adds to the distinctiveness of currency.
That trademark feel of American currency is also a product of the specialized paper on which it's printed. And surprisingly, the main ingredient of that paper is something you might be wearing right now. According to the U.S. Mint, the life expectancy of a circulating coin is 30 years. The Federal Reserve estimates that the average lifespan of a $1 bill is just 22 months. Money will return on Modern Marvels. Now we turn to money on Modern Marvels. We all know money doesn't grow on trees, but it does sprout from, of all things, blue jeans. The discarded scraps from the denim garment manufacturing process are sold by the ton to make the cotton-based paper on which United States currency is printed. This is the facility hungrily buying and stockpiling it. Trynna Company in Dalton, Massachusetts. Since 1879, this family-owned firm has produced all the specialized paper used to make American banknotes.
There's no getting around the fact that the paper in a banknote is much of the mass. It's at least 90% of all the material there. So it's like the crust in a pizza.
Waste cotton comprises about 75% of the material Crane uses to make its banknote paper. The other 25% is waste flax. Paper currency must endure a lot of wear and tear. Paper made from wood pulp couldn't survive the abuse.
The fibers in wood pulp are not as long and not as strong as the fibers in cotton. We have nearly pure, highly crystalline cellulose in cotton, so it's much stronger, more brittle, a rattle in the paper when you move it, a crispness, all those characteristics that make U.S. currency paper so distinct when you feel it.
Achieving that distinctive feel, which counterfeiters find very tricky to duplicate, is the result of a time-honored and painstaking process.
The first job is to remove some of the natural waxes and oils that are associated with the otherwise very pure cotton cellulose fiber. And this and the oils and waxes are generally removed in a pressure cooker, in what we call a rotary boiler.
For 2 hours, 6,000 pounds of cotton in the 15-foot wide boiler cooks in a caustic bath of sodium hydroxide and other chemicals. A conveyor then dumps the steaming shreds into a pulver that breaks down the cotton into smaller fibers. At the same time, water washes away the caustic chemicals still lingering in the material. Another conveyor advances the cotton pulp toward additional washing stages.